The Danube River, located in northern Scandinavia in the heart of Sápmi, is often regarded as one of the finest salmon rivers in Europe. It also marks the official border between Norway and Finland. For local Sami, however, Danube is not a border, but an ecologically, economically and culturally continuous region, a bond that connects the people. My people, that's where I come from as well, full disclosure. Before roads were built along both sides of its banks after the Second World War, the Danube was the main Johtavat. It was passage, way, route, channel, connection for everything. People, news, provisions, mail, building materials. In the Danube Valley, Sami families have lived long before the state border, which was first established by the 1751 Strömstad Peace Accord between Denmark and Sweden. These were the major kingdoms at the time. The Sami have been living in salmon along the 200-mile-long Danube for thousands of years, building deep knowledge of and connection with the river and its fisheries, as well as developing specific fishing methods and systems of salmon fishery management, stewardship and governance. Historically, Sápmi was organized into dozens of sitas. Sita is the traditional Sami social and political organization comprising of a small number of extended families and their territories. The Sita governance system allocated lands and resources to the use of individual families. Hunting and fishing took place both collectively and within the family units, depending on the method and season. So the Danube has been a strong unifying force in the valley and continues to be so for the Sami families living on both sides of the river. It was very touching to hear the stories this morning, Cheryl's story, and then, sorry I forget your name, but Elifuraha's story. Many of us have these stories about border splitting our families. And like my family is still living, we're living along the river, but suddenly there was a border, and so my great-grandparents had to decide which side of the river they're going to settle in, and got a citizenship accordingly. So these kind of stories are very similar, and are part of our genealogies and family histories. It's a way of connecting us, but for the past 250 years, it has also served as a dividing element. So in this peace accord in 1751, the Danube River was split down in the middle and made it into an international boundary, becoming one of the oldest political borders in Europe. However, an addendum to the peace accord called the Lappkodicell granted free passage for reindeer herding Sami to cross the newly established state border, migrating with their herds between the winter and summer pastures. The Codicil also established a system of local Sami courts as a community dispute resolution mechanism, and along the Danube, authority that also approved collective fishing methods. The gradual imposition of state borders in Sápmi in the wake of a number of colonial wars between surrounding kingdoms did not interrupt these established practices and regimes, which could be taken as an indication of strong Sami ownership and governance of the river and its resources. Next. So, but what are borders? As we know, Sápmi is today divided by the borders of 4 nation states: Norway, Sweden, Finland and Russia. On the left, you see an artistic rendition of Sápmi as a unified whole by Sami artist Hantuan Matisen. And the other one is the sort of the geopolitical reality today and how the borders split us. So what I'm talking about is the northernmost border between, like, where you see the red dot for Kautokeino, and they're up that border, like that's where the river runs that I'm talking about. So, according to some scholars, borders are not merely geographical margins or territorial edges. They are complex social institutions which are marked by tensions between practices of border reinforcement and border crossing. On the other hand, there are spaces in which transformations of sovereign power and the ambivalent nexus of politics and violence are never far from view. And we have heard about this already this morning in the in these talks and seeing what it means in practice. It was very moving to see those images of that wall going up. To observe these dual tendencies is not merely to make the banal but necessary point that borders always have two sides, or that they connect as well as they divide. The same observation has been made of rivers. They have either a strongly unifying or dividing element in human-environmental relations using the river's waters and shorelines. Next one. Tärnu, with the largest wild Atlantic salmon stock in the world, has long been a popular and well-known river for recreational fishing. It is also one of the last wild Atlantic salmon rivers in Europe. Since 1873, salmon fishing in the Tärnu River has been regulated by bilateral agreements negotiated between Norway and Finland. The first agreement signified also the first ban of the collective Sami fishing methods of tuhastärni and rastapuoltu, kind of two different methods of making a dam, sometimes closing the river for a short period of time. To some degree, these bans were ignored for several decades, demonstrating the dominance and perseverance of Sami law and norms in the region, at least up until the mid-20th century. Recreational fishing in the Tärnu began in the 1850s when English anglers, who were frequently members of the British nobility and upper classes, arrived and brought the now common fly fishing methods to the river. You can see in the picture. This tourist fishing, as it's locally called, increased rapidly after the road was built on the Finnish side of the river in 1957 and has skyrocketed since. So much so that there's a common local Sami saying according to which the river is black with tourists. While local businesses benefit from, and in many cases depend on this tourist season on the Tärnu, which is obviously the summertime, many feel aversion to the reality of that their river has been taken over by fishermen typically from southern Finland. As a result of this large-scale tourist fishing, there are two categories of fishing rights in the Tärnu River today. There are those who are traditional Sami right holders who have had the right to fish, including with traditional methods, on the basis of the individual land ownership along the river, and then those daily permit holders, which is a category for everybody else. So I was mentioning that the fishing is governed today by this bilateral agreement. The most recent agreement was adopted or negotiated in 2017. The negotiations began in 2012 to heed some scientists' warnings of declining salmon stocks, and then it culminated in this new agreement, which restricted traditional Sami fishing methods and fishing rights by 80%. So there's a legislative requirement, both in Norway and Finland, to consult the Sami people through the Sami parliaments in matters affecting them. There's also a so-called deterioration ban of Sami culture in Finland, which requires all authorities to ensure that the material foundation of Sami culture is safeguarded in all land use activities in the Sami region. The two main means to comply with this deterioration ban include meaningful substantial consultations and impact assessment processes. Yet meeting this consultation requirement is, however, frequently circumvented by authorities at all levels, particularly in Finland. So then this agreement, this newly negotiated agreement, there are two teams, one from Norway, one from Finland, and they comprised of equal numbers of state and Sami representatives. However, the equal numbers was more or less a smokescreen, as the final stages of the agreement was hammered out behind closed doors, while the Sami representatives were asked to leave the room before the negotiations. So they were basically sitting in the hall while the final details were negotiated. So it's not surprising, given that how much it restricted traditional Sami fishing rights. The proposed agreement was vehemently opposed by nearly everyone along the river. Prior to and after the signing of this agreement, local residents and traditional right holders organizations extensively lobbied and met with various state officials and agencies through their representative organizations and elected bodies, including the Sami parliament. They pointed out the number of unconstitutional paragraphs in the agreement contravening local Sami property rights, Sami cultural rights, non-discrimination, and state obligations for cultural heritage and environment. One form of resistance to the new agreement was the Ellos-Tätno movement that emerged in summer solstice of 2017. A small group of mostly young Sami women and men set up a camp called Tjärresulla Moratorium on an island in the Tätno River near town Ohtseokka, where I also come from, and declared autonomy on the island and the waters surrounding it, stating that instead of the states, the area is now governed by customary Sami law. They also announced a moratorium on recreational fishing around the island, which implied that fishing licenses purchased from the state were no longer valid and fishing was allowed only with permission of local Sami rights holders. So, back to these agreements. For many, this agreement, the Tätno agreement, threatens the survival of Sami identity. Somebody said that, I think it was Sherry, you was saying that the lake is us, we are the lake. As this is very much the same sentiment, that the Sami are the river, they are the river. So when they can't fish there, so it's like they are no longer who they are. So there's this very strong sense of losing part of them if they can't continue fishing in the river, but also this connection to the knowledge, the traditional knowledge that goes with these fishing methods, like you can't transmit them to your children. So in the words of the Upper Tätno Fishing Cooperative in its letter to the Parliament of Finland, quote, "The agreement robs Sami of their rights and kills Sami culture." So the ongoing erosion of a unique fishing culture with its own traditional knowledge and skills will only intensify as the younger generation, many of whom are now considered in the category of tourists in their own river because they live elsewhere for their studies or work, are deprived of a range of skills and knowledge related to various traditional fishing practices, including weir, gillnet, seine, and drift net. And I'm in the category because I don't live there all year round. I'm there for summers because of my work. I'm supposed to buy a tourist license and be a tourist in my own river. And I haven't learned these traditional fishing methods of like weir or gillnet or any of that. What I've been doing the last few years, fishing illegally. And I think like the people patrolling in that area, they know better not to come and ask a license. They can drive by in their boats. Because I'm happy to go to court because it's part of that Ellos-Tätno movement. If you can go back, and maybe you can stay in this slide. That was part of like illegal, illegal fishing, and there's some people who went to court sort of prove their point that taking state, challenging the state. So what I argue that this new agreement erects a new type of a border, or better still, a wall in a region where the state borders have not been as closely or intensely patrolled as in most international boundaries. And this is what Chandra was referring to, that the East, there has been since the 1950s this Nordic passport union that you don't need to actually stop crossing the borders of Nordic countries. You can just drive through, and occasionally they may stop you, but in most cases you're not. So the border is not so intensely felt. But now we have this new Tätno agreement, which I argue that it seeks to destroy the connection to the river and to the knowledge of the river and salmon fisheries in the name of protecting salmon stocks. And this crisis of salmon stocks, which is a fact disputed by one of the key scientists who've been working on the river for 20 years, saying that it's not as simple as this standard science, whatever I call this research group, says that it's not, you cannot just say that the decline is because of the overfishing, that there are many factors that should be taken into account. So has been this supposed crisis has been used to impose measures to drastically limit traditional Sami fisheries, and I suggest that this is settler colonialism at its finest, using environmental arguments to eliminate the Sami as a group of right holders, and by doing so, gradually eradicating the connection of the local Sami to their river and their knowledge of the river and the traditional fishing methods. And I draw this idea of the agreement being a wall from political theorist Wendy Brown, who suggests that the proliferation of walls and barriers in the contemporary world is a symptom of the crisis and transformation of state sovereignty. And she suggests that even if nation-state sovereignty is not finished or irrelevant, states' previously presumed monopoly of global political power is ever more disputed. And this post-Westphalian order is characterized by erection of walls to define nation-state boundaries. Yet the new walls are not, however, built as as defenses against potential attacks by other sovereigns, but rather they target non-state transnational actors, individuals, groups, movements, organizations, and industries. And of course, we can see this here too, but better with the Trump wall and many others. So Brown suggests that the wall-building frenzy is illustrative of waning state sovereignty and power. I quoting her, rather than resurgent expressions of nation-state sovereignty, the new walls are icons of its erosion. So I build on Brown's argument and propose that in the post-UNDRIP era of recognizing indigenous people's rights to self-determination in international law and indigenous rights, globally gaining strength and political and legislative leverage, the Nordic countries increasingly feel that they previously steadfast sovereignty claims are no longer entirely unshakable. So this new sense of insecurity, combined with this heightened extractive drive in the Arctic, you know, like the everybody's this last gold rush to the Arctic for the mineral and natural resources, has boldened Nordic countries to seek to eliminate the Sami through this legislative assimilation. So not eliminate through genocide, but legislate them out of existence. And as they no longer have access to the river, they basically either start doing something else or move away. So in conclusion, there's this existing state border that runs in the middle of Datno River, and the new Datno Agreement has created a wall between the river and the banks of the river that prevents Sami, who have lived from the river for generations, from being who they are. As the result, Sami people kind of progressively disappear either as Sami, they are assimilated, or literally through migration to urban centers, leaving the river for tourists as the frontier summer playground, who quote, carry their sovereignty and lifestyles with them. So the Datno Valley then becomes a fishing tourist's Ultima Thule, but with certain site specificity. So they kind of like create their river in their own image, kind of like re-envisioning it with a fisherman's paradise in a true north. And this is what you saw, if you can go back to the fishing picture, previous one. Like these are kind of the images that you see how the river is marketed, but also how in local papers it's being discussed. Like we don't see it in ourselves necessarily in these pictures. To quote a scholar called Verasini, as these fishing tourists move towards what amounts to a representation of their world, as they transform the land into their image, they settle another place without really moving. But the other side of this transfer is that the local Sami are simultaneously being moved out of the way without really physically being removed. They are simply legislated out of existence or negotiated through these negotiations as traditional knowledge and rights holders. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm just thinking of it conceptually. You're looking at the fishing, and I go to Norway quite often, and you see these are the pictures you see from fishing, and actually on the flights going up in the sun, quite a lot of people going up there to fish. So I can sort of give first-hand account attestation to this kind of phenomenon that's happening. But I think what you raise is also very, very conceptually interesting. Because you look at the river, and I liked what you said, that the river itself is actually creating a border. And I don't know if you've been following the news, but just last week we had the commemoration of the fall of the Berlin Wall. And so on one side you have the walls coming down, on the other side you have, and I won't go into details of what is happening here. We have a very, very fascinating presentation from our young colleague here on walls. And it's sort of like, how do you actually reconcile different experiences and perspectives of what's happening? The walls are going up on one side, they're coming down on the other. You have the imaginary walls coming up, and also if we're talking about the wall, like what they were saying, that the wall along the US-Mexico border, you can actually see through it, so it's not opaque. So these are very interesting discussions. Thank you for bringing that up, because it gives you time to reflect, and I think that's what we're going to be doing here. We move now to East Africa, and we have the pleasure of listening to Elifuraha Laltaika, who has many hats. One of them being that he's the vice chair of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. He's a lawyer, teacher, practicing lawyer, so a man of great talents. And
thank you, Chandra. My presentation is, you can see, sound. Is that okay now?
Yes.
Great. Yes.
PowerPoint here?
Yes. Should I wait for a few seconds?
Sorry, I thought you wanted me to copy and USB.
Okay, I can also just present from here. Great. So my presentation is titled Aligning the East African Community Integration Process to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And when I was researching a little bit in order to write this draft book chapter, I came across a report that struck me as being very fundamental and incredible in helping me to frame the issues. And this is a report by the East African Legislative Assembly dated February 2017, and it's authored by the Committee on Regional Affairs and Conflict Resolution. So the East African Legislative Assembly, which is one of the organs of the East African community, which you are going to hear a meeting. And the report was based on a public hearing of pastoralists divided by the international border of Kenya and Tanzania. These are pastoralist communities living in Longido district on the part of Tanzania and Kajiado district on the part of Kenya. And it particularly related to the implementation of the Common Market Protocol, which I think is already a fault line because it is commoditizing indigenous people's livelihood, trying to fix them within the legal framework. But I was also struck by the general findings of the report, and for the sake of time I want to just quote one of the general findings. It says the Maasai speaking peoples, please take note of the S, the Maasai speaking peoples that transcend the Tanzanian and Kenyan borders share a cosmology and history that predates colonial experience. One of the negative impacts of the imperative of the Berlin Conference was to interfere and interrupt the family and cultural ties that occupies the Longido and Kajiado plains. So this was a eureka moment for me because I found out that they are not my words. In fact, my ideas have a backing of the Legislative Assembly of the East African Community. It also sees that the international border is a problem to the indigenous communities living in two countries because it has interfered and interrupted with the family life of these communities. So that was the basis for the oversight visit by this important body. And in the abstract to my paper, I say one of the effects is really community disconnection and rangeland fragmentation. And fragmentation has also touched the sacred places where these communities would traditionally go to pray. And they also shared refuge during prolonged droughts. And those knowledgeable of pastoralism would know that there are places that are reserved just in case there can be prolonged drought elsewhere, the community would move. So the aspect of mobility is one of the most important pillars, and unfortunately mobility is traditionally framed knows no colonial borders. So the colonial borders have interfered with that smooth cross-border mobility to take advantage of resources that are available scarcely in times and space. Academic attention. I said in recent years the debate about borders in Africa have gained fresh prominence. And this comes from a context where during the founding of the Organization of African Unity, we agreed as a continent that we should respect colonial borders, and this was very well intended in order to avoid interstate conflict. Is it intra-state conflict? That could be, really cause problems in Africa. So the founding fathers agreed that we should respect colonial borders. We didn't know their genesis, why they were where they were, but we agreed that it is for our betterment to just respect them. But suddenly you see academics really interested in questioning why those borders exist in the first place. And one of the entry points for academics is really to look at the regional integration. So academics are seeing regional integration as an important entry point to dismantle these borders, because the integration processes are seen as enablers of cooperation among states for mutual benefits and a wide waterfront of areas, right? So they are seen that once you integrate, you can relax your rules, cross-border rules, and therefore enable communities to develop without undue restrictions resulting from border control legislation. So academics have really written quite a lot, including Professor why should I forget my colleague, Ruhangisa, Professor Ruhangisa at the University, Tumaini University Makumira, who is an edited volume that takes into account all these problems relating to the borders and how those can be solved using the integration process. And as I say, the East African community is seen as a towering example. That is really one of the successful integration processes in the region, because it allows participating or partner states to relax laws, as I said, in order to allow cross-border movements of communities. But the problem is that the integration process for the East African community falls short of addressing challenges that afflict communities of East Africans that have been divided by the borders. And in this context, I'm talking about the Maasai pastoralist. And just by passing, I said that these challenges include rangeland fragmentation, and as I said, sacred places and refuge where communities would go to graze cattle in case of prolonged droughts. And this lack of specific provisions to really take care of the unique situations of indigenous pastoralists, it is at variance with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which a lot of other speakers have talked about, which requires states to provide an enabling environment for communities divided by international borders to continue engaging with activities that have spiritual, cultural, and social significance. So this amazing international law requires states to really disregard restrictions, border restrictions when it comes to communities that have been divided by the imaginary international borders. It's a law that requires states to put in place some mechanism that would allow that spiritual connection between communities to continue across borders. So my work in progress looks at the following. In a multidisciplinary approach, of course. What are the state-centric bottlenecks to aligning the East African community integration process with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples? And if you remember, I said the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is regarded as really one of the most wide-ranging law relating to Indigenous people's rights, the most comprehensive, because we also have another framework called the ILO 169. Says under Article 34 that states must put in place some programs to enable communities to continue cross-border interactions for spiritual and cultural connections. And we have the East African Community and the treaty, as well as a number of protocols that really fall short of implementing these provisions of the UN treaty. Now, what should be done? In my paper, I also ask whether the Indigenous rubric is a suitable platform for addressing governance and mobility issues in East Africa, right? Whether if we advocate for that cross-border spiritual and cultural right, the platform called the Indigenous rubric, which is very strongly established already at the UN level, looking at the UN commitment as well as the laws that I talked about, whether it is something that can also be helpful in the context of East Africa. And I also look at how can the state-centric problems be addressed in order to unite indigenous communities. Because I believe that once these restrictions are done away with, these communities can attain sustainable development goals a little bit easy. So what are preliminary findings in my work? One of the paper's key points is that the integration process will remain a rhetorical proviso unless indigenous communities, who are the main victims of the border restrictions, can gain their cultural and spiritual connections without interference. I have no time, but in the course of writing my paper, I realized that the underlying assumption for integration is really commercial viability. Is really to make sure that capital can move easily from one country to the other, including human capital. That's why you have the common market protocol. And I think this is totally at variance with the spiritual connections of indigenous peoples. Another is therefore to break free from emphasis on commercial aspects that underlies the integration process more broadly. And what are some of the preliminary comments on the bottlenecks, especially the state-centric? Number one is the concept of sovereignty. Every time discussions of freeing borders would find themselves on the table of policymakers, this aspect of sovereignty comes very prominently, because governments are very jealous of their ability to control what falls within their borders. So this may be a very problematic area in the context of Africa. It reminds me of the 1960s when our amazing founding fathers, and I need to mention just two to represent the rest, Julius Nyerere of my own home country and Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, said we need to unite Africa. And Nkrumah was really pragmatic. He said, let's unite today. Let's dismantle borders because we don't know their origins. Let's just be United States of Africa. And Nyerere said, no, let's slow down. Let's start by way of integrating regions, and then we can form. But the rest of our founding members were very skeptical because of the aspect of sovereignty. Everyone wanted to control the small country and have the title president. And I think that we cannot say anything has changed. Is going to remain a serious bottleneck even now. There is uneven development across the region. So a less developed country would be afraid that another country will take advantage. And if in our region, for example, Kenya is regarded as sub-regional superpower, and therefore any intention to over-relax the border rules may be seen as giving an advantage. And I think it's important to see the comparative analysis with the European Union, how that has been smooth. But also the effects of the status quo preservation resolve. This is what I said in the opening remarks, that Africa is founded on the agreement that we should respect colonial borders in order to avoid conflict. So this is one of the most important pillars of what has made Africa what it is now. And therefore it's naive if an academic would come up with suggestions which do not factor in this aspect of respecting those borders and what advantages that has brought over time. Is the Indigenous rubric a suitable platform for addressing those challenges? And when you talk about this, you immediately realize that the debate on the indigeneity in Africa is still ongoing. Who is indigenous? It's not as easy as it is in Canada, in the US, in Australia, where you can say, okay, the priority in time. Those who were there before others, and so on and so forth. It doesn't go that easily in Africa because if you talk about priority in time or indigeneity, then you are opening up possibility, and the conclusion may be that we are all indigenous. But the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, this is the intergovernmental organization charged with protection and promotion of human rights in the continent, settled this debate. It commissioned a study and came up with a report that is internationally acclaimed. And one of the conclusions, it says, in fact, we have indigenous peoples in Africa because they are similarly positioned as other indigenous peoples in other parts of the world in terms of their connection to land, marginality, and so on and so forth. And while the report doesn't give emphasis on priority of time or indigeneity in the context of being the first occupant of the land, it really looks at it as a framework for addressing post-colonial marginality that has suppressed communities that live traditionally, that occupy the land communally. And in this case, pastoralists, some groups of pastoralists as well as hunter-gatherers comes up very prominently. So if you like, this debate is settled in a way at the regional level. What remains to be debatable is at the country level, because I think countries are also afraid of some of the implementation gaps as well as demands arising from the frameworks or laws agreed internationally. And the report, as I said, has been endorsed by the African Commission and the African Union. So it is the property of the African countries. And recently we have also seen perfect, excellent, incredible work of the African Court on Human and People's Rights, where they have decided in a case involving hunter-gatherers communities called the Ogiek from Kenya, and the African Court issued a judgment saying they are indigenous peoples, and it came into that conclusion after taking into account a lot of international laws and agreements, and it said these are entitled to protection as per international laws relating to protection of indigenous peoples. Conclusion. Challenges are wide-ranging, as highlighted by the East African Legislative Assembly. I said it was a eureka moment for me, because it's really good as an academic, as a researcher, to find that a policy-making body shares your views on what is a problem on the ground. So the East African Legislative Assembly says these families have been fragmented, and it causes challenges that need to be addressed. And therefore, it gives me the ability to suggest that the integration process should take the communities, the affected communities' collective perception, expectations, emotions, and passions on board, without just overemphasizing the commercial aspects and as embodied in the protocol on common market, because that is the language spoken, but it's really at variance with indigenous peoples. And I said indigenous communities attach extraordinary significance to spiritual, cultural, and social values as a community. So to them, the ability to cross the border, I think there was a speaker here in the morning talking about ceremonies, baptism, the ability to bury the dead ones. You see, those are fundamental issues for indigenous peoples, because they touch on their cultural and spiritual connections and social values. Is just not about their ability to cross the border and sell their livestock. It should be seen in terms of wider perspectives than just commercial viability. And Article 36 is really there to provide the normative grounding, and what remains is innovative interpretation on the part of academics, and I hope this symposium has really been in that direction, providing thinking or signposts on how to really understand Article 36 and implement it. And we also need innovative interpretations on the part of regional courts that have been established in order to provide a smooth integration process. With that, I thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Eli for a very precise presentation. I just want to make a couple of comments. One is you referring to Article 36, which is on the cross-border. The 39. Oh, sorry. I'm used to the UN where the red means. We always try to do things a little bit differently. And so just to thank Eli for his very precise comments. And a couple of comments. One was in terms of the article referring to the cross-border cross-border need for cross-border exchanges and communications between Indigenous peoples who are living across borders, and to actually recognize that this was known as the Sami article, because it was the Samis who actually presented this during the declaration process. And I happened to be there. I looked at my friend Andrea, she was also there. There were also others. So it's quite interesting that we have the two of you sitting here with us. And of course, when the Samis presented the case, it was very compelling. It kind of reminded the rest of us, as an Indigenous advocate, that these were issues that affected us much more than we were actually taking into account. This was 20 years ago, 30 years ago, so it took a lot of time. But some of the issues that Ellie raised, and I also want to just inform you that I was recently in Africa, in Banjul, in the Gambia, just last month, and we were there for a meeting of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, and this was in relation to the African report. And it was fascinating to be there and see how, within the context of Africa, they have been able to have such advances. I mean, as Ellie said, it is very uneven development. It's also very uneven regionally. You look at Latin America, which in some cases is very much advanced. You know, you have the Latin American system, the whole system with OAS. Then you have the African system, which is actually doing stupendous work. And I just want to let you know that, we have within the UN system, we have the interagency support group on Indigenous issues, where all the UN system, we all work together. Very good to recognize Fiorella here, from my colleague from the Department of Political and Peace Building Affairs. They changed the names.
These kids are now going to the great schools of this nation and other ones that a long time ago we only dreamed of going. We weren't allowed to go to school till like the 1920s or 40s. It was banned. Native Americans could not go to school. People think of women voting. That happened in America, in the 60s or somewhere there? Well, it happened after that for us. We weren't even allowed to vote even then. So we made progress because of a voice. Your voice is still probably the strongest thing that you have. And we'll continue, all of us here, being the voice, and sometimes even just a kind word. And sometimes even if you trip and fall vocally, doesn't mean you failed. And we get up again, like Muhammad Ali says, the greatest champions were knocked out, but they got up again and they fought. And that's the message we have to take and give to our children, because once we're gone, who's going to carry this fight and this flag? It'll probably be them.
I think it would be very appropriate. I guess for tomorrow we won't be here, but you'll include recommendations and some sort of final statement. Something to form a global Indigenous Peoples Border Alliance. You can even say GIPA, right? GIPA. But I think another recommendation that I would have is that we also look at alliances with other bodies where Indigenous peoples are working. For example, IIT sits on the UN Committee on Food Security that opened up to Indigenous peoples after the UN Declaration was adopted. And they have a pastoralist committee. But the issue of borders and food sovereignty, food security for Indigenous peoples, whether it's pastoral or seeds or rivers, fish, all of those things, buffalo, could be something that they could be raising, because that's a state body as well. So I think we need to form an alliance, a global Indigenous Peoples Borders Alliance, but also part of the work that could be done is look to see, like for instance, I'm on that UN facilitated working group for the UNFCCC, look and see the relationship between borders and climate change. I think Amy referred to that about, they're draining the sacred spring there. to build the wall because it needs the water for the construction. But what is that going to do to exacerbate and increase the level of the pace of climate change in the desert? In that part, which is where I live too. So I think we need to see where these issues could be raised in other UN bodies and alliances. But I think we need to build or create an Indigenous Peoples International Borders Alliance. To start to compare these stories with each other and the solutions that we're coming up with as well, and to build our voice, because this connects to a lot of different things. The decade of languages, the fact of that border has created where the Yaqui language is still fairly fluent in Mexico, but it's not fluent anymore. I would say kids are learning it in school, but that's different than fluency. Fluency is that's the first language you learned in your house. So we have much stronger in Mexico, but on the Mexico side of the Yaqui Nation, but not the Arizona side. So that could be an issue that's being talked about with, we're going to have a decade of the world's indigenous languages. Look at the effect of borders on indigenous languages. I'm just saying, to find these links of how we can build alliances and include this issue in what's being discussed in some very innovative work in other areas, but that have a link. So those are my recommendations. You can add them in. Thank you.
I just wanted to share that on, I guess, the grassroots level, because I'm not an academic, and I'm not, I don't sit on any big committees or anything. But through the help of grassroots communities, I think particularly within this past year, being able to travel to Palestine, being able to travel to Finland and to Mexico to meet with the Zapatistas, those are things that we're working on. As I guess the younger generation is we are more global now, and we are in a place where we're having these conversations and picking apart these systems of oppression. So for me, going to Palestine and learning that the concrete that came, that is used for the laws in Palestine came from Mexico, so it's well, how does that, how is that not common knowledge? But how can we work together with indigenous, both of our communities to dismantle that? And also talking about climate change, and even just more local, close to home, with the integrated towers, the surveillance systems that are slated to go up on the Tohono Nation. Through our research, we found out that a big part of that project is being headed by the Salish Kootenai tribe. They have a communications and technological firm, they call it SNK. So it's, it does come down to how do we as nation to nation, tribe to tribe, have those conversations and kind of take DHS out of the middle. Because, we've talked about that. If we are to have surveillance on the nation, maybe it's better to work with another tribe to do that. But that's hidden, that was hidden, and we had to do research to do that. So transparency, honesty, I think is a big thing in order to move forward with that vision. Because a lot of times we don't realize what's happening behind closed doors, and how we're all tied together in that way. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just to add, first of all, I agree with what the previous speakers have said, but to add that over the last few years, and I think this is a result of struggles by indigenous people themselves, the UN has expressed institutional commitment and also developed some normative frameworks that create spaces for indigenous peoples to really collaborate at the global level. And therefore that is also an important area to consider because they are a result, as I said, of struggles. And I should mention the forum that I'm part of, that it's really the biggest gathering of indigenous peoples. We meet at the UN headquarters here in New York annually with a lot of indigenous peoples, and Chandra is clear, should agree with me that the forum has always been very generous, doing away with the restrictive rules that would make it hard for indigenous peoples to come and express their views. And we also have the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples sitting in Geneva, and it has recently been reformed to really cater for a lot of comments by indigenous peoples. And I mentioned in the morning that we also have the mandate of the UN Special Rapporteur. That is extremely important because one of the functions is really to receive complaints and can also request information from states. So while we are talking about how we can build alliances, let's also remember that we have those official spaces that didn't come easily. I just hijacked, if I would say, but a lot of you have worked really hard over the years, and they can recognize faces here, and read quite a lot of stories about you. So let's make use of them, right? Because they unite us and they give us platforms to do dialogue with the states. At the forum, we have a day that is dedicated for dialogue with governments from a specific region. So Africans should be in their room, Asians and so on and so forth, to really listen to governments and try to build their capacity. So we are not deficient of spaces for alliance. That was a problem 20 years ago, but now we just needed to strengthen them, and things will be solved in that direction. Thank you.
I'll just allow me to add to what, the thing with the UN is, we love the UN, it's like our grandparents. When our parents don't listen, our nation states, we go to the UN, raise our concerns. But after observing the UN for 10 years, I also realized that there are structures and structures within the UN. For example, for the indigenous people, it's one major group, indigenous people's major group. So they decide everything. A few people decide. It is not egalitarian enough that our voices are not able to get there. So we have to we love the UN and we'll continue to engage. But we have to do it in a way which is beyond project basis. Because within the UN also there are these superstructures created which do not allow community participation. And that's something which I have been feeling for almost so many years. And for indigenous community, we will have to break that, because that cannot be a solution for many whose voices have never been heard.
Speaking from the UN perspective. Thank you, Bina, for raising that. This is an issue that comes up many times, that how can the voices be heard? And I have the UN, it's green, okay? Is it worth it? Yeah. Anyway, but one of the challenges that the UN faces, you have to remember that the UN is actually member state driven. You have to lobby your member states. And just to quickly respond, when you talk about the indigenous people's major group, that is within the context of the Sustainable Development Goals. So that's a different process, and I'm glad Andrea is here, because there's also been a recent platform that is established, which is with indigenous peoples in the UNFOC. But I wanted to just come back a little bit to actually thank you to Andrea for raising it about the International Year of Indigenous Languages. And this is a very concrete example of how you can actually make things happen at the UN. And I'm just going to give you this as a very small example, that indigenous peoples came to the Permanent Forum and they spoke out about how they were losing their languages, and that in some communities there were only very few left who spoke the indigenous. What can be done? The Permanent Forum listened to them, and they asked us from from the UN to organize an expert group meeting, something like this. And we had that some years back, and some of you were there as well. During the expert group meeting, we brought in experts from different regions, different countries. There were many who came and spoke, and they said, for the UN to give greater attention to this, they should be a year and they should be a decade, which is devoted to indigenous languages. The Permanent Forum picked it up and put it as a recommendation and said, the Permanent Forum hereby recommends that the UN should declare an Indigenous year, not just a year, it should also declare an Indigenous decade. This was then listened to by the member states, and the member states then put it into a resolution at the UN General Assembly, which is like the decision making that says what should be done. And they said, we hereby declare 2019 as the International Year of Indigenous Languages. Indigenous people have now been saying 1 year is not enough. There's very little you can do in 1 year. You have a little bit of attention, but you need much more. They said we have to have a decade. So this year at the Permanent Forum session, the Permanent Forum's members actually listened to all of you and put it back into their report to say, which goes to the UN system, to say that we recommend that 1 year for the International Year is fantastic, but we want a decade. A decade will bring much more action, attention, much more awareness. Member states have listened to that, and now in the General Assembly Committee, they have actually decided that there will be a decade of Indigenous languages starting in 2022. This is expected to be adopted by the whole membership of the UN General Assembly in December, but it's kind of like already agreed. So it's from 2022. So just to let you know that your voices are actually heard. You do have an impact, and what Ellie said, that all these things that happen, they're kind of incremental. It's a result of your struggles, your voices, your demands. It's a very bureaucratic structure, it's very slow, painfully so, but it is there, and I like what Ina said, it's like the grandparents. Oh. So think of it as very benign grandparents that will be there for you.
You mean the belly of the beast? Someone who's been at the UN, like Chandra, we met each other. Elsa and I were talking, we were trying to figure out what year we met each other in Geneva, and that's where I met you, Chandra, too. You were working for ILO back in the 1980s. This was, yeah, before. Anyway, I just wanted to add about the Year of Indigenous Languages, because we got it adopted at the Human Rights Council in September, and then it went to the General Assembly. But I think what you're saying is really key, Bina, because the question is, okay, how is that going to get to our communities to actually make an impact? Everybody knows the UN says that every 2 weeks an Indigenous people's language disappears, which means the last fluent language speakers pass. People that learned it as their first language. So how do you restore that? We're having actually a conference in Oklahoma this Friday and Saturday, because in the United States is one of the 6 countries in the world that the UN says is the most endangered, not Canada, not Mexico, but the United States. And in the United States, Oklahoma and the Pacific Northwest have been identified as the most endangered. So we're having a conference with all the tribes that a lot of them are coming, hosted by the Chickasaw Nation at their cultural center, to hear from them, okay, what can the UN do? Now we know we're going to get the decade, but what can they do so that you get support? Because only Indigenous peoples can save their own languages. But what do we need from the UN in the decade? What are the recommendations that can support? And I think that's, I mean, we organized, Treaty Council organized that with our tribal allies in Oklahoma. I think that's what we have to do. That's what we did, like what I talked about, you know, to make the impact on international policy on the pesticide issue. We started in our communities. What's going on here? You know, what do you see here? So I mean, we all have to take responsibility. We know the UN is it's an organization of member states. They've never done one single thing for us that we didn't make happen. I mean, people talk about the UN Declaration so easily. They don't talk about the hunger strikes and the walkouts and, you know, all the things we had to do to just even gain a voice in that process. You know, so you need to think about that. And how can you engage your communities? That's up to us. And I'll just say a final thing based on what Peter said. You know, after we had Jim Anaya, who was the UN Rapporteur on Rights of Indigenous Peoples, after he did his tour of the United States, all the people that had organized events and hearings for him got together at University of Arizona. And it was really profound. Someone from the Navajo Nation Human Rights Commission said, you know, we got great recommendations from Jim Anaya, treaties, and I mean all kinds of really strong stuff. But, you know, where's the teeth in this process? When you get it into the UN level, where's the teeth? Where's the implementation? It says, and then I thought about it and I realized, wait a minute, we're the teeth. You know, it ain't gonna happen unless we do it. We are the teeth. And we have to force those countries at every step of the way. And the way to do it is start in our communities. What does your community say that they need to preserve or restore, protect their language? What do we need from the decade? And then we go tell them, you know. And I think that's the only way we're going to be able to make this happen. That's how we got the platform, you know, at the UNFCCC. We took the word of indigenous traditional knowledge holders and food producers and said, this is what we need from the United Nations. And these are the safeguards on rights we require before we'll tell you anything about traditional knowledge, you know, and climate change. So we're still trying to get that work plan adopted here now in Madrid coming up, but at COP25. But I just wanted to say that because I think we can't look to them to help us. They're looking to us for help now, and we got to tell them. And the only way to tell them is go to our communities and say, what do you need? What's happening here? Thank you.
We have one last question, and thank you to Kumi for waiting so patiently. Please, sorry about that.
Well, actually, it's more of a comment, and somehow I think it's very sad to share what I have to say, which is that within 50 years from now, many of these states might not even exist. The UN might not exist. I mean, what we now know, all this will be evident within 10 to 15 years. Then we will know the actual parameters of climate change. And then we will know that within 50 years, there will be somewhere between 300 and 600 million people on the earth. So what will water peoples do? You will be, you know, the guardians and the host for enormous people's movement, like we've had in the past, but we've forgotten about it. But the indigenous epics have glimpses, historical glimpses of these movements, which happen, you know, many hundreds and thousands of years back. I really think that also it's needed to look again into indigenous epics to understand what kind of historical exposure and experiences are encapsulated there. Because now, I mean, it's becoming a real scenario. And it's so frightening that we would like to sort of, you know, put it away, but I think we can't. We should start to discuss it, and we should really think again about how did indigenous and native people 3,000 years back, when you had also environmental disasters and so on, how did they react? I'm going to talk about the Harappa civilization, which was an advanced urban civilization. Because of environmental changes, most of these citizens again became farmers and hunters and gatherers. They actually shifted back to completely new kind of survival strategies. And I think these kinds of lessons need to be lifted out, put into perspective, and we need to prepare for it, unfortunately.
Last, very brief, I think.
Very briefly, we Yakis are used to doing things in 3 hours, 3 days, 3 weeks.
3 weeks.
Anyway, we were discussing about the teeth. You know, there are many things that as a cultural and tribal leader, and even if you band together as an organization or a group, you can do. There's a lot of things that we've done in the last 20 years, but one of them was real simple. You're in Scottsdale, Arizona, and you see all the posters, and you see how beautiful it is, and we were having a traditional burial there, and an all-night wait, and the Scottsdale Fire Department came with their hoses and tore down the cooking, traditional cooking outside with wood, and then the fires, the bonfires to keep people warm. And he said, this is the law in our city. You are not allowed to do this. And within a week, I went and met with the mayor. And I said, Mayor, when you throw an arts festival, when you throw some kind of something in the historic district or something, you always make exceptions and rules. You even provide security, I said. So why couldn't you accept that the Native American tribe lives within your beautiful city here? And make those same exceptions, but cater it to this day, we have not had a complaint or a bonfire shut down. And to me, it just took sitting in front of the mayor and explaining to him, we have been here hundreds of years before you were here. You have adapted things that you didn't consult with us. And now we're gonna work together on a solution. So that's what it takes sometimes. Just like the fireworks bill, national now bill, Congress passed it. We were the lead tribe because the city of Tucson told us on our opening of our heavens and our visit to the people and our ancestors that are up in heaven, we weren't allowed to throw fireworks until we got congressional people at the U.S. level, and they passed a fireworks bill. And not only us, but there were several tribes that joined on that, and a bunch of congressmen, and that's how we did that one. Because in the city of Tucson, it only said cities, towns, and churches, but they did not recognize our way of honoring, the heavens and our way of church. But now it's in there now. We changed that already. So we've taken on violence against women. We were one of the lead tribes that did that because the horror story was a non-tribal went to the reservation, got mad at the wife, pulled her by the hair, stuck a screwdriver in her head right here to the back. And we're going to sit back and let them do that? So we passed and we pushed for those laws. That's only one incident. And the sad thing about it is our police can take him off the reservation, but tomorrow he'll be back saying, I'm sorry, and they'll accept him back, or the lady will. So, but it only traumatizes her. It traumatizes the kids, the grandparents, the community. So you have to push and work, even at that level, at the ground level, like you were talking about. Changes can happen if you work and let jurisdictions, whether city, county, state, and then federal, and then now at the global, like I was explaining. But there's more things that we've done as a tribe to try and protect. But thank you.
Thank you all very much. If you have anything else,
I'll just add my thanks to all the panelists, especially those coming up for a second time. Thanks for your time and energy, and thanks to Ellie and Rauna as well. Chandra.